So we have our dependency service already calling the corresponding show method for iOS and Android. During this lecture, I want to focus on adding precisely some share functionality to our iOS project. Now, before doing that, I do want to change something in here. As I told you in the previous lecture, I should have added that method, this share report method, that, by the way, I'm no longer going to be calling from the addExpense method, from the categories VM, because it is going to be in the categories VM where I will eventually have a share button or an export button that will eventually be calling this share report method. So let me just go ahead and add the corresponding using directives. And this is the first change. So now we have the method in the correct class. Nothing really interesting happening in here. Now, what I do want to add is the iOS functionality for sharing. Now in here, what we want to do is share a file that I will be creating in a later lecture. It's simply going to be a TXT file with some information about the expenses that this user has been generating per category, which is why I want the button to be in the categories VM. So what we have to do, of course, is show natively what iOS does when sharing anything. And for that, we're going to need to create various things. First, we're going to need an array of objects, but NS objects that is native to iOS. So that is one of the reasons that we're going to be using the dependency service here. We're going to be using native objects. And this array is going to have first the title of what we're going to be sharing, and in this case, only the file that we're already receiving. So really just the file path. Then we're going to need a controller, and the controller as a UI activity view controller, by the way, which is again entirely native to iOS, is going to be the one performing this sharing. Now, as I work through that, I am going to need to know what view controller is visible. So if you haven't ever developed for native iOS, the view controllers are what we maybe call pages. So when on Xamarin we define a page, on iOS we define view controllers. So what I will have to do is I'm going to create a private UI view controller method that is going to be called getVisibleViewController. So this method is going to do precisely that. It's going to go ahead and get the view controller that is currently visible. And for that we can actually, let me just go ahead and get the root view controller, which is already going to be inside of UI application, which has a shared application object that has inside of key window the root view controller. So just like this, we already have that root view controller, but I want to return the presented view controller, which is the actual UI view controller. Now, there are some scenarios when the presented view controller may actually be null. So let me go ahead and first make an evaluation over here. If the presented view controller is null, what I will have to return instead is the root controller itself. And there are a few other scenarios that I want to consider. The presented view controller may actually be a navigation controller. So you know how we have a navigation page over in Xamarin Forms. In iOS it works similarly. We may have a navigation controller there, and if the presented view controller is a navigation controller, we don't want a navigation controller, we want a view controller. So I can make an evaluation. If the root view controller's presented view controller is a UI navigation controller, then what I want to return is from that presented view controller but as a navigation controller. Let me do something else in here. So UI navigation controller, I'm basically getting the presented view controller like this as a UI navigation controller. And let me get all of this inside of parentheses. So all of this as a navigation controller has access to the top view controller. So simply, if this is a navigation controller, I want the top view controller instead. And finally, this may be a tab bar controller, which is actually what may happen in our case because that is what we have. So that is the other evaluation that I want to make. If the presented view controller is a UI tab bar controller, then again, I don't want to return the tab bar controller. I want to return the view controller that may be selected in those tabs. So I will do something similar to what happens if this is a navigation controller. I will return as a UI tab bar controller. Let me get the presented view controller and get the selected view controller. So I just needed to make sure that those scenarios are covered. Now over here in the show method is where I want to use it. So I will get the view controller by calling the get visible view controller. Once we have the view controller, I am going to be creating the things that I told you about. First, the items that are going to be shared. And this is going to be a new array of NS objects. I do need a using directive in here. And I'm going to be creating first an NS object from the title that I'm receiving and an NS URL, which at the end inherits from NS object from the file. So by the way, I tried to build this. That's why I was seeing some errors. I wasn't done with writing this. But, you know, we're going to have this array with 2 elements so far. And then I'm also going to be requiring an activity controller. And this is easier to get. This is actually going to be a new UI activity controller. And the creation of this, notice, is at least one of the overrides for the constructor going to require an array of objects. So this UI activity view controller is the one that is going to be sharing precisely these objects. And the array of UI activity is going to be null. Now, once we have this, let me go ahead and evaluate if the popover presentation controller is different than null. So if it is not null, which means it already exists, I want to set its source view to what we have in our view controller that we have just received from the get visible view controller that we created, and get the view. And this is it. Finally, we can actually present the view controller. So view controller, present view controller. There is actually an async version of the present view controller method here. And I will just present the activity view controller. Optionally, this can be animated. Let's do that. And I am going to be awaiting this. After all, I did define this as a task. So this is it. This is everything that we have to do on iOS. We are going to be receiving that title, the message that, by the way, I am not setting currently, but really the important thing here is the file. I am passing those as an array of NS objects, getting the activity controller, evaluating if it has a popover presentation controller already. If it does, I will set it to the view from the view controller that we have just evaluated is the visible one. And there, in that visible view controller, present that activity controller with those items, by the way. We are creating the activity controller with those items that we want to share. By the way, precisely the activity view controller is the share view that we see on iOS. So there you have it. This is how you're going to be able to share on iOS. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to go ahead and add the functionality to be able to share on Android before we head back to our shared project and now in a shared way create whatever is going to be shared through these methods.